You don't exist. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowed like sis. Dead up perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look up better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of What If Deku Meets Overlord? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of lazyfrogofjustice on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Glass and concrete exploded on contact. The walls of one of the abandoned warehouses by the port near Tacoma Beach broke apart in mere seconds upon collision. Seagulls wailed in terror as they scrambled off the scene. The sun was at its peak, and the waves of the currently murky waters of the shore leading to Tacoma glistened under the sun's light. It was a stark contrast to the largely covered warehouse. With most of the windows boarded up because of unused of the facility, the entire whole stretch of lot with these old buildings were dilapidated, old, and decaying. A perfect place for something to be nurtured. Or at least that is what some would think. That F hurt. Mirko groaned as she tried to stand up. A slight bruise was starting to form on her arm, but it was nothing to what she was actually used to. The chase from earlier proved to be a lot more than she expected. These machines can pick up enough speed. It almost outpaced her in some occasions, and that was saying a lot. As her maneuverability even in cityscape environments were very well documented, only beaten by a few heroes within the top 10's list. The chaotic chase allowed them to eventually leave the cops and the rest of the heroes behind on their trail as she clung on the DMN thing trying to subdue it. But because of the frenetic situation and the surprising speed of the machine, she was only able to focus so much until she finally ripped a vital component out of it. And now, she had crashed with it in this place. The chaos of the chase making her dizzy. Her ears drooping down slightly. Gee God, good thing I haven't taken any lunch yet. She groaned once more to herself as she dusted her legs and arms off. A sigh escaping her lips as she finally stopped these things from wreaking havoc. It was a lot more sloppy than she usually preferred, but she got the job done right in time, preventing it from making further damage. She looked at the DMN thing that had its frontal armor caved in. Sparks and other machinations powering down, except for a small light that continued to beep with a sound. The sunlight coming out of the hole and unbarred window atop putting a pseudo-spotlight on the robot. Smoke coming out of it as she inspected the remains. She raised an eyebrow at it as she went closer, pulling out the beeping contraption that was glowing in blue for every interval of a second. Odd. She mused to herself. Thinking at first that these things were merely erratic in nature. Their movements unsupervised. To wreak havoc and do as much damage as they can, but it lead her to somewhere. Somewhere with less people. Less conspicuous in nature. Isolated. That lead some sort of suspicion in her eyes as she looked at the eerily silent inside of the warehouse. Cobwebs and empty crates surrounding her vision everywhere. A thought then formed in her head. This was a random destination, right? Nothing connected to these. The contraption from the robot on her hand beeped in a more intensifying rhythm. She looked with a piqued interest as she looked at the direction it was pointed at. A ray of suspicion entered her mind as she moved the contraption to the left. The beeping becoming less intense. She returned it to the direction prior, where the beeping increased yet again. She then placed her free hand on her beacon and communicator placed on her belt. She clicked it in place, hoping to tell those working the radios that she found something and would continue to pursue, but she also noticed that her device was glitching. Like something was sabotaging it. A quirk. She suspiciously looked at the direction the beeping was at its most intense state and for a second her grin turned back to excitement. This had to lead somewhere. Somewhere where the perpetrator of these robots were. Probably a trap. She grinned at that thought as she clutched the contraption with a renewed sense of excitement. The thrill of combat wasted on these things could be repaid in kind with the creators of these bots. That would surely satisfy her somewhat, even if they did turn out weaker than expected. She decided to pursue the signal of this contraption and get to the bottom of the mystery. With the sounds of sirens coming closer behind her, she knew that it was all right to go. Even if they were slow enough to keep pace with her actions. She will finish the case by herself until then, and even if she did need backup they would come to her aid eventually. Her odds at defending herself were not poor. She actually invited danger to get a crack at her. She leaped atop the crate that was barring her access to the direction the contraption was pointing her towards to. She allowed her enhanced senses to kick in for her to better navigate this mystery of a warehouse. With her eyes now seeing the place atop with the aid of slight levitation from the crates. She looked as far as her eyes can see, noting that the abundance of crates stacked against each other was blocking her sight from viewing the entirety of the place. The area was dimly lit, only a few rays of the sun glancing from broken glass or unbarred windows were the only sources she could get light from. Thankfully, that was not an issue that barred her from continuing. She had some form of heightened vision acuity after all due to her quirk. There were not at all that much passageways to speak of in this place, but she could hear the beeps of the contraption intensifying with the direction pointing northward. Into the more darker parts of the warehouse. Where eerily, with what she could see was a single light source in the middle of the darkness. An ominous detail that made her eyes widen for a moment. There was no electricity flowing into this building that she knew of, based on the evidence outside. Yet a single piece of assumingly artificial light was illuminating the darkness from what she could see on her vantage point. Her smile deepened. Whoever this person was, they were keen on setting a lure to draw someone in. She looked at the beeping contraption and thought of a plan. She was not the most stealthiest hero out of there, but she knew how to keep her movements quiet and precise. Danger was still a possibility, and if this was a trap she was eager to welcome it with open arms. The BSTRD or group of bastards would expect someone like her to be easily latched under their fingertips. She would allow that thought to blossom. Just enough before her chance of kicking their butt to arrive. Just what I needed. She whispered as she clutched the beeping hardware on her hand before she silently made her way towards the small source of light. She jumped over crates with mastery-level precision. Making her feet land just enough to muffle their sounds with a technique she mastered over time. With a few sneaking paces along some parts of the way, she neared the final stretch of her destination with enough time to spare. Her eyes then caught the sight of something that got her attention. The area where the light was. Is empty. She tilted her head in confusion. As she hid herself in the shadows. Taking note of some scientific hardware near the wall, looking dilapidated. Old. Outdated in a sense. Cobwebs and the like were filling them. Like they were abandoned for a long time. That was a red flag. She turned her head to another part of the medium-sized space this part of the warehouse had. A few curtains, covering what looked like to be old screens. Some having cracks on them and other covered in dust and other particulates. There was no sound. No whispers. No startups of any machine being heard by her senses. The only menial sound was the contraption now beeping within less than half of a second in interval. She frowned at it in result. This was set to be some kind of trap. She knew of it. She was sure of it. Yet, there were next to none in indication that stated this was one. Like all the visual evidence was there, but a part of her still rang true with how suspicious this is. She looked around once more. Her surroundings. Behind her. Everywhere. She tried to discern with enough knowledge that she was not cornered. That there were no bots or villains hiding in the dark. There was nothing to indicate that at a first glance. Even if there were, they were very good at hiding as it would seem. But that was not the problem, was it? The problem was trying to discern the mystery, or that her paranoia was making her think of stupid things. Alas, there was only one way to find out. With enough clearance and bravery to steel herself in motion. She leapt from her position and landed just shy of a few inches from the one source of light illuminating one spot within the warehouse. The eerie sight looking like a spotlight in theater shows. She gazed up, knowing full well that whoever made this setup would have noticed her by now. But so far nothing that would indicate that. Her eyes surveyed her surroundings once more, looking for clues. Nothing. There was nothing. In a situation like this, with her experience alone, she knew that she was able to stone herself from fear, making her rid herself of doubt and distractions, yet the atmosphere of the almost cold and eerie setting made her feel uneasy in a way. A bead of sweat trickled by the side of her face. It dropped into the floor a second after. The sound of it entering Mirko's ears with how sensitive they were. The sensitivity of that sound making her reaffirm that nothing was hindering her ability to sharply hear her surroundings. So what was this? What was making her feel on edge? She swallowed in her fear that was starting to permeate. With fists coiled to strike, she decided to step into the light. Knowing that if this was a trap, then that would be the opportune moment. As soon as she placed herself just within the boundaries of the spotlight, her body froze in stillness. Instinct came over her. Like a prey item being watched in the shadows by a predator. She stood absolutely still, her senses blaring in full, telling her that there was danger. That something was amiss. She looked at the hairs on her arms. Upright they stood, stiff. Her tail behind her back all the more irked in posture. Like a deer on headlights. Seconds pass. Yet nothing. Not a single action. Not a single motion. There was truly nothing amiss. Just the steady collapse and fall of her chest along with the sound of the contraption beeping with eerie intensity. She tilted her head sideward. Looking around once more. Trying to understand why she was led to this place. From those DMN machines and their, suspiciously random attacks, to the dead silent warehouse that she was now in. Could this be just an accident? Was her paranoia, playing tricks with her mind? I assure you, dear, thou events leading to thine self were not in any manner, accidental. Mirko's ears and body jumped in action as she placed herself in the direction pointing towards the voice. Unfortunately, there was nothing there and the voice was heard, within the confines of her mind. It was not spoken in a verbal manner, which meant that whoever did it had a telepathic quirk of sorts. Or something of that caliber. She gritted her teeth. The coward was playing with her. Show yourself, she shouted as her voice echoed within the warehouse. A PRGNN pause of a moment was shared as the beeping once again filled the air as the only sound. A froward person such as yourself should learn patience. We are not in a hurry here. F off. If you have something planned, be done with it. I'm sick with all of you villain types. All constantly yammering what they want or what they want to show to the world. A pity party is not the person that's standing in your little spotlight today, you BSTRD. Whether you're a person done off by being sick in the head or someone that wants justice for the world. I am not the sort of listener that you want to lay words with. If you want to fight, then let's get this on. I'm tired of all this waiting and sneaking around. The venom in her words were palpable, like a snake baring its teeth towards its prey. She could not see where that person was, but she knew her words managed to get the message across. She tolerated no bullshit, and whether these guys think they were justified with their actions, she would not let them break the law. Nor will she let them escape. Come on. I know you got some dumbass trap about to spring on me. You wouldn't have lead me here if you didn't have one. She taunted as she raised her fists. Ready to meet any challenge that would come forth. She then waited with adrenaline coursing down her veins. Her proverbial claws unsheathed. ready to pounce any enemy that would come forth or to intercept any intended trap that she knew had the most bullshit of complexities. She would meet it head-on. After a few seconds, her senses finally managed to catch something. The haze or blankness of nothingness was seemingly dispelled. Like the person just appeared out of nowhere. Her eyes could not see it, nor could she make sense with it. Which was odd, given that she had decent vision against the darkness. Possibly a quirk. But people usually had only one quirk. Why would this person have two? Or could there be another one? She shook her head. Even if there were multiple hostiles, she could deal with them. She just had to make sure to at least get one of her targets straight. With fists clenched, she readied herself for whoever it was that would appear. Only to hear a squeaking sound of sorts. A clear faint light of red was seen. It was ominous and it gave out a clear thought to the imagination. Like a boogeyman in the dark as Mirko felt it come near. Her instincts screamed at her to bolt away in fear, but she stood her ground. A sweat drop cascading between her eyes as it dripped on her bosom. Another squeaking sound. It was continuous. Like a bladed weapon scraping itself on the ground. She moved her legs in a fighting stance. Not letting the ebbing and slowly crushing fear to overcome her as she readied herself to pounce. A million situations coming into her head on how to proceed as the squeaking noise continued. The beeping on the contraption intensifying to another degree. Sensory overload was starting to attack her ears, but she kept her composure. The squeaking and the faint red light coming ever closer to be seen with her own eyes. She could feel her nails within her fists about to bite her skin as she clenched them tighter. The tension and suspense making her blood boil. "Come on," she screamed as she lowered herself to attack within seconds of seeing the enemy firsthand. She was about to pounce and attack when the squeaking was close to inches away from her. Only to stop. The squeaking halting in motion. The red light faintly flickering towards her. Mirko gasped. The sweat on her face gone cold. The adrenaline halting immensely as her body returned to that of a calming phase. The fire in her eyes replaced by confusion and surprise. The boldness in her words snatched from her ire as she gazed on what she saw. The tightness on her fists was gone as she opened them partially. For what lay before her was no such deadly villain. No mechanical parts with bladed appendages sharpened to kill her. No laser-firing eyes that were about to burn her. No large being or persona that would liken her for battle and death. No. What lay in front of her was the opposite of that. The once ominous red light was merely the only functioning eye of the one that lay before her. The squeaking was with the rusty old wheelchair this person was using. He looked disabled. Old. Vulnerable. His features that of a goat for a head. Two horns coming out atop a worn-out hat that was once supposedly better in shape. It was musty, crinkled and filled with dust. The fur of the goat man upon his face was disheveled. The striking part of it was that one side was where his red eyes were cast while the other was wholly covered by what seemed to be a scar for a burnt half of a face. Cauterizing his other eye shut. With a part of it singed off revealing fleshy, sensitive skin to the base of his neck. The old figure was shaking slightly to what could be attributed to Parkinson's disease. Its clothes were that of a Victorian era. Torn in some places, musty, old, and very much worn out of time. Golden braids of the attire were now shaded out, pale in color and lost all its beauty. The figure's arms were also in a worse shape. The once sharp claws that adorned its digits were either broken, bent, or worse hung to his form by the sides of the wheelchair. What concerned Mirko the most was the fact that the figure had no legs of sorts. Only stumps where the legs should have been, wrapped by blood-crusted bandages hastily placed by what she could infer was a bad medical practitioner. The most worrying part was that the contraption was beeping intensely to this man. Like this was the target. "You've got to be shitting me." The old goat man squinted his eyes at her. "You are the one that defeated my creations?" Are you not? He said. His voice matching the one that spoke in her mind, but it was more hardened. Strained. You made those things. Those robots, she replied. The goat man nodded. You were also the one that spoke in my head. He once again nodded, though it followed with a short, strained and painful cough. Mirko was exasperated. This is a joke, right? J-joke? Thou does not create jokes. Maiden, you may be child, but thou are the rival that you seek. Thou hath created the chaos that brought you here. Thou will be your enemy. The goat man proclaimed, with its arms lifting in a shaking manner. Aha! Surprised, are you not? Or doth you see thyself as someone of no worth against your might? The old goat man said in a more serious manner. Normally he would have said this in a threatening way, but Mirko merely had her left eye twitch in response. A full might of anger boiling inside of her, wasting her time. Now, since you are a very impatient, maiden, I will speed thyself for your benefit. The goat man said as Mirko did not heed his words. The seriousness of the situation now gone from her mind. Yet the goat man was eerily unperturbed by her demeanor towards him. He only looked at her and a curve of a smile appeared on the edge of his lips. Mirko, who was not listening and tuning out her brain in disappointment, waved him off. Look, old man, if you were really the DMNBSTRD that actually made those robots, despite your disability, I'm just going to go over the fact that you almost got someone killed out there. You definitely need help, and I am not wasting time on your petty excuse of a crime just to be your rival. So just surrender yourself before I force you out of you, VERYYYY. Where the hell are you going? The old goat man started to wheel away from her. Thou are not taking me seriously. The old man said with a heavy strain on his voice. Like the small action of him wheeling himself away took a lot out of him. It brought Mirko to yet another sense of disappointment, considering. Lights from up above suddenly switched on, illuminating a few spots where she noticed distinct things from earlier. The curtains with the screens behind them and old machinery. Rusty and dented old hardware were now clear to her eyes as the old man wheeled himself forward to face himself back to her. A spotlight now shining down on him much like hers. The gray fur he had along with the now accentuated burnt half of his face was now seen with much more clarity. If this man was not anything but the pretender he wanted to be, Mirko would have shown pity. For the injury and the state he was in made her uncomfortable on how to exactly deal with his antics. Another sound followed as Mirko saw a small remote on the old man's palm. The curtain from earlier slowly moved away, revealing the musty, old, and cracked screens it was hiding. The screens then turned on in a rhythm as sounds of static filled the air. There were 5 of them in number. Placed right next to each other, as the screens tried to disseminate the footage they were trying to convey. Mirko suddenly felt as if the atmosphere changed. A more prominent and distinguished feeling now started to nag on her brain. Doth thou have your attention now, girl? Mirko looked at the old man. He had a slew of confidence in his wake now. She decided to continue her attitude from earlier when they first interacted. With a snort she grinned at him. This is supposed to make me think you're a rival to me, old man. Because if it is, then I think you just amused me. Those robots weren't even tough and yet you want me to fight you. Got a death wish, Gramps? Mirko waited for his reply, only to be responded with a guttural, unholy and unnerving cackle. She was taken back by the response, having not felt nor heard such a distinct laugh from her whole experience as a hero. The way how his voice continued, even though it sounded like it hurt, made her hair stand up in attention. The best way to describe it was like the old man had his throat torn inch by inch with each attempt at speaking out aloud. It was that painful and disturbing in tone. The next move, however, ultimately made her regret ever talking back in an antagonistic sense towards the old goat man. After her recovered from his unnerving laugh, he snapped his fingers. And another set of lights turned on around her. 5 spotlights, shining on 5 steel posts fashioned into a cross. Within those 5 posts, were badly beaten and wounded civilians. The beeping contraption she was holding fell on the floor. It was the only sound that filled the void for a few seconds. The contraption then rolled towards the old man, stopping just short beneath him as his old, crude and dull claws for fingers shakenly took the device into his palm. Eyeing it with slight interest before turning back to the now frozen heroine. What about now? Recovering from the disturbing sight took a few seconds out of her. For the civilians were tied to the posts like that of how the Romans punished those that committed crimes. They were crucified in the worst way possible. Blood was trickling down on the posts, pooling somewhat at the bases. They looked tortured. Beaten to SBMSN, with so many wounds akin to that of whips and knives along with bruises forming on their bodies in a pale and unsightly purple. The sight made Mirko's heart drop just with the sheer audacity of what was being shown. She was no holy person in any way. She did not even believe in such things. But the sight can only be described in one thing. Demonic. That of whom caused this was simply cruel to the worst extent. And Mirko cursed herself for not being able to sense, understand, or even remotely see them when they were just there, near her. Yet moments ago she felt nothing. Nothing at all. Like they simply appeared into existence after being absent from the world around her. Her heart began to beat in faster intervals. She saw the state of the one in the middle post. Arms splayed on both sides. A girl, aged not far from being 10 or so, had one of her eyes closed shut from bruising. A gash was dripping blood from her head. Her arms were filled with so many lacerations. Both deep and shallow. Her yellow shirt, which had Mirko's symbol on it, was now ripped in the middle with blood seeping on the fabric. Worst of all, was her skirt. For blood was trickling on her legs. Like an injury was there below her. Oh God! Her mind started to think of the implications of what she saw. The girl was barely conscious. Along with the rest of those on the posts. A boy younger than the girl in front of her. A woman with her arm nearly torn from the base. A man who was shaking in pain for the many deep cuts on his stomach and chest. Lastly, there was old man, who was the closest to death, was leaning his head forward. Blood and saliva dripping from his crusty, bleeding lips. It's Mirko mama. She's going to save us, the girl whispered in a painful croak as Mirko saw her looking directly at her. The words making Mirko purely and utterly devastated. A million negative emotions now ran rampant in her head. She then looked at the old goat man who had a ghost of a smile on his strained, burnt face. Why you? She said with a low voice. Disbelief, anger, shock, and utter devastation placed on her face all at once. Her emotions spiked to full. Uncertainty, rage and clear mass of negative feelings were now bottling up within her body and soul. The magnitude of the crime made her sick, just as a flicker of blood splashed on her face. Blood that belonged to the girl. Why you did this, she once more said. Her fists tightening. The anger in her mind taking over. Inhibitions were now gone. There was only the tunnel forward. The tunnel and decision to raze the evildoer to the ground. The old goat man once more cackled. Thou dares you to move. Unless your city and the people you save see you for who you really are, he taunted within her mind, and the old villain clicked another button on the remote he was holding. The screens then changed completely around her. The once static background was now replaced with footage from 5 designated locations. 5 random locations within close distance, or close enough to the city she was now in. The mundane and peaceful outlook stopping her from a moment from acting. It was then followed by sounds of machinery turning on. Cameras. Facing at Mirko's face. 3 angles. All of which were transmitting. Transmitting on the signals of all television screens, within the entire country. Doth consider thyself as a credible threat? Or thou need me to further show you how this little game of ours is played? What the F is this? She said out aloud. Not knowing that millions of people were now confused seeing the rabbit heroine on their screens. A game. To be played by thou fair maiden and thyself. The old man mused. Mirko angrily looked at the man and was about to attack him. The audacity and cruelty displayed far too much for her liking. But before she could, the man raised his crude, broken claws at her. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Even if you do pummel me to the ground. Even if you shame me or rid me of thine life, dear maiden, you would only make your situation worse. For thy game is not played by one player, ridding thyself off of the equation would only result in you not being able to save the people amongst those in the screens. He then focused his one good eye on her. Or the family you see before you. A hostage situation. Mirko frowned. She was not one who liked to be controlled. She did not want this to escalate where a single innocent life was killed. She then thought of a plan to somehow get this all over with Bifo. Tell me your answer. Mirko flinched. The words were like a command. Like something was forced on her. A feeling behind her mind nagging for her to say something. She stood there in confusion as another trickle of blood splashed on the floor next to her. Tell me your answer. The old goat man once more said. Mirko blinked. Suddenly the old goat man snapped his fingers once more. Mirko's body went stiff in attention as she heard a guttural scream of pain. The man, the father of this family, she assumed, shrieked as he tried to wiggle himself out of his bonds. Mirko's eyes widened in fear and shock as she stood in a stunned fashion. The man then continued to howl in pain as tears started to bubble on his eyes. However, try as he might, something worse happened. His skin slowly turned red. Steam was coming out of it. His skin then started to boil. Bubbling in mounds of liquefied tissue and pus as blood started to pop from the surface. His face then turned into a misshapen mass, as his shrieks were slowly muffled. Before his entire head blew apart in an explosion of gore and superheated blood. Splashes of blood and brain tissue lay splat on the floor. Steaming as their heat was enough to burn it. Mirko could only watch as the remains of the man's body slowly melted itself apart before his arms fell off and his body landing on the floor. The hissing sound still continuing. Along with the cries of pain and sadness from the other civilians crucified on the remaining 4 posts. Issei, and no. The woman weakly said, shaking in pain and in sorrow. Peepa, Pa, the girl in front of her said as a soft sob was heard from the other young boy and a gurgle of sorts from the old man who was edging closer to death. But that was not the worst thing that happened. For even though many watched the horror take place on the screens of their televisions, the old goat man simply cackled as he saw one of the 5 screens that was within the room. Footage overlooking Kiyoshi Ward shopping mall. Mirko only had a second to realize before she knew what was to happen. Toshinori Yagi had successfully stopped a robbery taking place within close proximity of Kiyoshi Ward's famous mall. Being the hero All Might, he was able to stop the crime swiftly and quickly before everything got out of hand. A few patrons, fans, and police were swarming him as he smiled in delight with a wave. He only had a few minutes left in his hero form after doing as much good as he can in the few cities he stopped by over. He figured that it was down to luck after all, things were going well. Nothing major of note so far, so retiring the day at this hour was fine. He did have faith in the heroes of today. As he escorted the last of the criminals into the police van, he was met by a little boy who was asking for his autograph. With a huff he allowed the boy the pleasure as he wrote it down on his shirt. He smiled happily as a few onlookers took pictures. The boy was eventually called out by his parents who were about to enter the mall together. Toshinori waved in kind as the boy smiled. Small moments like that made up his day more than ever. It made him feel proud that he was able to be the hero his MSTR would have wanted him to be. He was then about to leave by saying goodbye to his fans. Only for it to happen. Tum. A great pillar of fire suddenly roared into existence. Its size and width were hundreds of meters above the ground. Seemingly biblical in proportion as it roared into the heavens above, parting the clouds in the sky and blocking the sun's light for a few seconds. The entirety of Kyoshi Ward's mall engulfed in the flames within seconds of everything being normal. Everything suddenly stopped. Even Toshinori, the hero known to everyone as All Might, froze in place. But being the first to recover with the Inferno's rage, he tried to push himself forward, with his mind railing on saving whoever he can. "No!" he screamed. But just as he was inches away, the flames suddenly got whisked from existence. The heat died down, leaving only smoke, and nothing else. Toshinori felt himself trying to register the shock. As the smoke dissipated, showing nothing else but charred ground. Like the entire place was vaporized within seconds. Along with everything with it. People. Civilians. Everyone. Toshinori suddenly felt his body kneel in place, before a piece of cloth fell on his lap. The shirt of the boy who smiled earlier after getting his shirt signed. He grabbed it afterwards, slowly encasing his palm with each finger as his tips were now filled with ash. For the first time in his life, ever since he lost his MSTR, Toshinori felt powerless. Mirko heard the blaze of fire from the sounds her ears could perceive. Worse of all, she could see the aftermath on the screen. Torched like the flames of Gehenna, razing that area to the ground. At first, Mirko was in disbelief. But this was real. Quirk, or not. That happened. It happened. She looked at the old goat man. "You genocidal piece of SHT, she angrily cried out as tears formed on her eyes. She wanted to hurt the old man so bad. But all eyes were on her. Even if she did manage to, more people could be hurt. More people would die. And their BLD, along with the BLD spilt, was because of her doing. Her sanity dropped to a crawl as the old goat man looked at her. "You never answered my question. You paid with that in kind." Rumi shook in place. Emotions running rampant. "This is AF game, to you?" The old goat man placed a hand on his chin. "No. I suppose not. Though I do find everything amusing. Fun isn't something what my age can deliver upon because of my disabilities. But this is truly an experience. Especially with a maiden such as yourself aiding me by playing along." Mirko was speechless. "Now, fancy to play along now? Or should more lives suffer because of your temper and inability to control your emotions?" The words hit her like a freight train. "On with it," she challenged. "Already thinking of ways of stopping this. Don't be so hasty, dear maiden. We are merely starting." The old goat man said within her mind. The constant change from telepathy to natural speech all the more making her vengeful. "Then tell me what this game is." The old goat man smiled, wheeling himself closer to her in proximity. Not at all scared with the dangerous aura now filling the woman. Mocking her in that manner took all of her willpower to keep herself from taking him on. The sudden change of speech from archaic punctuation to normal, present speech allowed her to realize that the BSTRD was playing her under his palm. "You are a hero, yes?" Mirko did not reply. The old goat man tilted his head. "Speak." After saying this she gritted her teeth. "Yes." She whispered in reply. "Then you do know how to prioritize, correct? To know which things need to be done in order for the greater good to be well spent on society's annals." He then focused his one eye on her. "This also means you know what strong choices are. What true decisions do in order to maintain the peace and prosperity this world needs. He explained as he pointed his finger towards the footage. Mirko then looked at the goat man. She then turned towards the screens. One was on Hosu General Hospital. Another was on Esuha Market. One of the screens was directed on the infamous Omi building of Fukuoka City. And the last one was directed on the top-secret facility known simply to the heroes as Tartarus. Oh. Do you understand now, dear maiden? Or do I need to do what you heroes call as, monologue? I think that's the word. You are used to things like this after all. Mirko's eyes widened at his words. Was she being the judge to choose who was to be spared and who was to die? Yes. You think of that very notion right, my dear. This is the simplicity of this game. You choose who lives and dies. You being a hero would be adept at this. Knowing what to do and how to react if given the strong choices to deal the greatest good or compromise with a sacrifice to let others live. Her heart sank. This was beyond her. Why, you can't be serious. Oh. I am dead serious, and don't get it in your head that some people will interfere or stop the deluge that's about to happen. I've seen you heroes. I know what you all can do. I know how tempting it is to do the right thing even if the odds are stacked against you. Which is why I'm giving you the chance now, he said to her as Mirko felt confused at his statement. What do you mean? She said in fear. Beg them to stop trying to save the people on those screens. Why the F would I do that? She tried to say, her voice wanting to act tough, but it fumbled in the end. Becoming shaky as she looked at the 3 cameras stationed around her. Because, dear maiden. He then pointed at one of the screens. Her heart dropped when she saw hawks in one of the screens, flying towards the Omi building. His red wings clear to the eye as horror came to her face. For a split second, her eyes widened. That would be the result. Stop, she shouted with a hand outstretched. No one heard her within that moment. Just the feeling of helplessness. As the inevitable came. Kigo Takami, also known as the hero Hawks, flew in great speeds towards his target. It was bad enough that the public saw All Might's failure beckoning in the very screens of everyone's television, internet, and phones. The shock of the attack put everyone on fear and in frozen shock. But he acted. He acted desperately as the police only started to recover from the great aftermath of the Kiyoshi Ward Mall destruction. He saw the live feed on the situation Mirko was in, and with a paling expression, he saw one of the buildings within his own city. He was on patrol that day, after finishing his lunch on a rooftop. But now, he could only force himself to try and fly faster. Reaching speeds more than anything he had ever experienced in his career. Only to save the people in that building. To save what he can amidst the crisis. Come on, he screamed to himself as he tried to soar within the sky. People in worry and concern as they saw him zoom right above their heads. He was nearing the building. The city familiar to him like the back of his hand. He could do this. He could achieve this. He could save everyone in those buildings before everything came down in cinders. It's Hawks, one of the civilians said on one of the opened windows of the building he was trying to get to. His sharp senses made him stop just enough as winds blew under him. The sudden stop made him hover just meters away from his target as people saw him with faces full of relief and happiness. Stay tight, he commanded to them as he activated his individual feathers. Hundreds of them, no, as many as he could muster even if it meant his stability in flight was going to be strained. He would save them, he told himself. He would save them all. As his feathers shot forth in speeds that would take seconds to reach his target. Seconds in which he imagined people being pulled out of there, was only replaced by something else. His smile started to slowly turn bright. Only to be overturned when calamity struck. Tum. A bright inferno with temperatures rising to that close to the sun surged into the blue sky. It was instantaneous. The adrenaline building up inside Kigo was suddenly lost as his eyes bear witness to sudden smothering of all the smiles that were happy to see him within just seconds earlier. It was now, all replaced by bright yellow flames. Flames that enveloped his entire vision. Hawks could only lay still himself on the spot he was in the air. His wings flapping slowly as burning pieces of his feathers rained down from the heavens. Like a morning aftermath to the failure he was still trying to comprehend. To those who watched closely, they could only see a fallen angel of sorts stuck in the air as burning pieces of his wings slowly landed on the ground. It was deathly silent as everyone watched it unfold. No words were cast. Just the eyes of horror on their faces. "Ha, he was faster than I thought," the old goat man said. Mirko felt herself getting hotter due to the anger boiling within herself. With red now within her vision, she looked at the old man in pure, surreal anger. Ready to break his bones. To emasculate him and make him feel some of the pain of all of those that died today. But before she did, she was stopped by the sound of someone coughing in a painful, guttural sense. Mirko's head slowly turned to the sound. The feeling of her heart sinking yet again to another depth of what could possibly be hell was shown. As the little boy on one of the posts started to cough and vomit blood. Agra. He was convulsing, as the soft cries and sobs of the living mother and daughter tied to the posts filled the air. The boy continued to cry out aloud in a weak voice as he continued to regurgitate everything his bod was ejecting out of his mouth. Mirko could only watch. She did not want this to be worse if she acted or tried to save him. Yet she let the boy die this way. All because her heart had now arrived to a point of no return. Steadily, the boy died seconds later. Pieces of his intestine now dangling from his mouth as stomach acids and bile formed a small pool below the ground. Tears were rolling down Mirko's cheeks. She then turned her head as the prominent sound within the room was the old goat man cackling to her expression. To her emotions within that very moment. Interference is not allowed with our game, dear maiden. It is only your choice. Your choice that would decide the next event over, because I know for a fact that those fools outside now get the incentive to not interfere with our little affair. Funny, isn't it? Your yearn to save lives is now the entire reason why you're losing so many innocent people in the process. Ironic. Mirko looked at him with a blank, callous, and dark expression. Decisions do matter a lot. Especially in your line of work. Which is why I am giving you the chance to choose. To choose what manner of fate lies ahead. To which you would whether allow the death of one person in exchange of many, or allow the pitiful single soul to live on in exchange of the rest dying in the proverbial hell. He explained, two hands outstretched in a mocking manner. Showing her what was at stake. You now have 3 decisions left. 3 places. 3 people. You do not know whose life is tied within those choices. You don't know which location is tied to whom, and lastly, you don't know whether what would happen if you make the wrong choice at the right time. Mirko only looked at him with an intense glare. The only thing you can do, is choose who lives and who dies, dear maiden. As simple as that. Nothing complicated. Nothing extraordinary nor puzzling to think about. Mirko stood by for a few seconds. Looking intently at the cameras placed at her direction. Seeing the screens with the many police, people, and heroes gathered. Merely inches away from the locations. Fear and uncertainty filling their hearts. She then saw the 3 people on the posts. Begging. Crying to have them be saved. The mother foremost, was asking her to spare her daughter. All these decisions, with weight as heavy as the world itself in her eyes, were now thrown at her all at once. Her visage had been broken, her emotions lay bare. The vulnerability of the person known as Rumi Usajiyama was now seen by almost everyone in the country. The world even. What was she to do? Now, care to tell me who you wish to save? Or do you wish for someone to die within this room? Mirko looked at him. Her eyes wet with tears as the man once again waited for her response. Panic started to form in her mind. Panic of the most primal sense. Tell me which. She looked at him as seconds passed. Fists tightening. Tell me. She angrily looked at him for playing her this way, but she cool. Time is running short. Stop. For F's sake. What do you want? What's your goal out of all of this? Why did you prepare all of this? To prove a point. That heroes like me are worthless. Trash. Tell me, she said in panic with all built-up emotion within her mind released in those words. That was not the answer that I desired, but, you do deserve some reason. Though I think you would be disappointed to know what it is. Just tell me. She said, a manner of pleading in her voice as much as she hated it. The old man then cackled. That disturbing laugh making her mind go dark in anger and annoyance. As he recovered he looked at her. There is no reason. Why would there be a reason? Do you think of me as an idealistic person? No, even if I did give you the choice, I was only doing this because I had the means to. I had the resources to. There is no existential debate or justified cause that I rally on, dear. This is just me. This is who I am, and at this very moment, I am having the best fun I've ever had in years. He taunted. Why? She asked, completely baffled. I already told you the reason. I am a man of simple desires and that longing now is to burn. Why you won't get away with this? She weakly said. I am not planning to. I am old. Ready to die, and even if your brethren raid this every place a few minutes or hours from now and relieve me of my life, this choice will still continue. The game will press on, and there is nothing on earth that will stop the inevitable death of either one person or the mass of souls in another place. That isn't fair. She said, her voice shaking. She was now being watched like a child. Scared. Afraid. Nothing ever is. Pummel me to the ground, dear. Kill me in the eyes of millions, there is no point to those actions. They will not amount to anything. The game and decision will continue, and those lives are now part of the many you failed to save. Terrible, isn't it? Mirko heaved for a breath. Now tell me your decision. Or would you like me to do it for you? Just this once. Mirko watched him as she tried to hold herself back. The final vestiges of her sanity stopping her from trying to kill this person. She was not a hero anymore at that moment. Only a human being. Flawed. Inclined to kill one life to spare the rest. Just like what he said earlier. Ha. I think I've waited enough. He said as he turned towards the grandfather tied to the metal post. He cackled as the old man now howled in pain within the background. The cries of the mother and daughter heard, but they were drowned out in Rumi's mind. She could only see the old goat man as the grandfather had all the bones in his body grow to an abnormal amount as they pierced and stabbed him from within. He died moments later as agony settled and continued to thrive within that very room. But Mirko was transfixed at the old goat man as he cackled. She then did the unthinkable. A guttural cry was heard. She then lunged towards him. She then grabbed his neck as they landed on the floor. The entire action to her felt slow in that very moment, but as soon as they crashed on the concrete, the wheelchair broke in pieces. Mirko then proceeded to break the old man's arms in quick and simple cracks as desperation and violence filled her mind. The old man yelled in pain as blood bubbled into his mouth. His grey fur now tainted with it as his broken arms dangled on the sides. Mirko then proceeded to hold his head in place. And aimed her fist into his face. Thwack. Droplets of blood flew into the air. Thwack. Thwack. The cracking of bones was heard within the combined sound of something wet. All the sounds were drowned out as she continued to pummel with all strength pressed on her fists. Thwack. 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 Mirko's eyes turned to that of pure rage as she aimed towards his face. Teeth and blood gushing out. Even his burnt half of a face was now bleeding. The eye socket cauterized there, now bulging with deathly bruises and blood. But she suddenly stopped mid-action as her bloody fist was raised into the air. Her mind cleared for a second as she saw the old man's face. The voice of the daughter on the nearest post close to her was filling the air. Begging for Mirko to stop the violence. Begging for her to stop everything. Mirko's tight grasp on the old man's face was relinquished. With a shaking disposition she stepped back. She then saw blood on her white, gloved fists. Blood on her face and blood on her costume. A pool of blood on the old man's body. Red. Red everywhere as her eyes can see. What had she done? The old man was not moving too. He was stuck on the floor. Tongue out in a morbid fashion. Unmoving. Silent. Sounds of dripping was heard, as the droplets of blood on her fists were now filling the floor. She could only look in sheer shock and trauma as the aftermath of her rage was seen. The cameras, capturing every moment of it. She had killed this person. She had killed him in the most brutal way in front of millions of eyes. She then fell to the floor, bottom first as she hugged her legs. Her rabbit ears dropping by her sides. She shook in place. She felt the unreal and harsh reality of her decisions. She also did not realize that after the grandfather died, the people of Esuha Market were spared. A few heroes and police were reluctant to cross over and evacuate the people within that area, but thankfully nothing happened. No flash of fire came. No burning souls were heard. But that was the price of her action. She let one civilian die, as well as kill one other person as well. Mirko could only sit in place as the cold air of the warehouse settled on her sweat and blood-laced skin. Her eyes in widened expressions. Nothing would make her forget this. Nothing. She stayed there for a few moments before a voice was heard. Mirko, please stand up. Mirko's ears stood up partially at those words. She then slowly looked up with her ruined and dirted face towards the source. She saw the mother, trying to call out to her on one of the posts. Please, just save my daughter. Her heart was beating in slow beats now. The woman looking at her. Pleading. With little motivation in her body left, she tried to stand. She could, still save these two. Right? She could still save them. She could save them all. But, was that going to be the case? Was it? I am going to get you out of here. Both of you. She said. With what little hope was left she stood up and went towards the woman, climbing the metal post as she saw the chain binds holding her arms in place. The woman smiled at her response, thanking her. But the very moment she touched even the slightest amount of skin on her body, she suddenly screamed in pain. The sudden shriek made Mirko's grip loose as she fell to the ground in a thud. The woman then convulsed and screamed in pain much like the others. Mirko could only watch in blind horror once more as she tried to cover her ears. The woman's body hissed. Black smoke covering her entire body. She was wilting in place. Turning into ash. She screamed to her to save her daughter, but she could only watch in silence as she covered her ears. Her emotions and sanity now too far gone from being humane. The woman eventually vanished as the ash flew into the air. Vanishing a second later. There was only the girl now left. Mirko then looked at one of the screens, scared with what awaited her eyes, but even though she feared the worst, she saw that Hosu General Hospital was spared. A pro-hero known as Ingenium managed to enter the hospital unscathed, without any pillar of fire raging forth. That only meant that she was left with one last choice. Tartarus, a prison full of criminals and the scum of humanity. Or, a little girl that was the sole surviving person within the family of 5 that was chained to these metal posts like a blasphemous declaration of art against society. She did not want that choice. It was clear what was the better path. The little girl, of course. But the law explicitly told her that everyone had a chance at life. Even the scum of humanity. It was one of the rules in the law of Quirks and the society she lived in. Pros were never directly allowed to kill villains, no matter their crimes. Some exceptions existed, but predominantly no one was to be judge, jury, and executioner. Only vigilantes were like that. And she was not a vigilante. Nor was she a hero at that moment. She had taken the life of one villain earlier. Yet why was this so strong? Why was this? She then started to sob softly. She was a failure. She was not a hero anymore. She was nothing. No one, and a complete criminal now. She covered her face in tears. The reputation that she built was now non-existent. She cried as the little girl on the post saw her idol and hero in shambles. She just sat there in broken tears. Not knowing what to do, while also knowing that if she did not choose nor do anything at that moment, the girl will die, as will many other people. Such a hero she was. She sat there sobbing as a blinding flash of light appeared close to her. Many were gathered outside of the scene, where Mirko was. Where everything started that day. The sun was now halfway in its journey to sunset soon. The day was coming to a close in a few hours. But civilians, heroes, and police were gathered outside of the warehouse. News vans, police helicopters, and many people were demanding why the heroes were not acting at that very moment to raid the place and save the two, but they were met with no answers as the combined force tried to stave them off, in fear that something may again happen. Takoba Beach had never been this populated in years. The country had suffered a blow in their morale with today's events. Especially since everything was still not done. The danger had not yet passed. Mirko was still in there crying, along with the little girl tied to the post. The onlookers felt their already crumbling hopes falter as time continued to pass. One of these onlookers was a particular green-haired kid. With tired-looking eyes and a worried expression on his face as he held on to his hero journal for dear life. Gripping tight for any news that would come out. Hopefully there was in time. And hopefully, it was good news. As the minutes passed by, everyone's attention was diverted as police and pro-heroes shouted in attention. For someone had emerged from the warehouse. People thought it was Mirko, successfully saving the last girl. But no, it was not. Instead it was a towering figure in black armor with a red cape behind him. His intimidating aura made everyone instantly silent and nervous. The police aimed their weapons at him as well as few heroes, namely Kamui Woods and Death Arms, who were ready to intercept, but they stopped dead center. After seeing that the wounded girl was on his arms. Everyone turned deathly silent as the tall figure walked towards Kamui Woods. He then placed the girl gently in his arms. The action making everyone stunned as they also saw Mirko trailing behind him. Bloodied, but had a confused look on her face. She was shaking while she stood behind the tall dark figure, for unknown reasons as the footage from the warehouse was now cut seconds before. When the girl was now in Kamui Woods' arms, the police then aimed their guns at the figure with the pro-heroes nervously readying themselves to arrest the man in armor. The public could only look in shock as murmurs started to form. Before the figure was apprehended, however, he merely vanished without a trace after a small flash of light. Everyone was left in a wordless state as the green-haired boy in the crowd watched in surprise at the action. Then they returned their eyes at Mirko, who collapsed on the ground. The toll of the day's events weighing in everyone's mind. Especially hers. To the green-haired boy, however, the shock and devastation of that day's events were now lingering in his mind. He then slowly walked away from the crowd without putting much eyes on him. Thoughts heavy on his mind as the sun on Takoba Beach was now drawing near to night. He did not know where he should go next. And much like the future as it is now currently, everything was now not set in stone. For something darker lies ahead. Mirko's eyes were now heavy with tears. Recalling everything had now returned her to the same spot as she was a day and a half ago. She was shaking on the chair she was sitting on as the detective wrote every detail she had seen in that very event she was in the center of. What happened in there, Miss Usajiyama? Why did the vigilante Black Knight appear out of the warehouse with the child safely intact? The detective asked. Mirko was unsure. I don't know. I was crying in my own tears. I just saw a flash of light, and he was there. I didn't look at him the moment it happened. I thought the kid was going to die because of that flash of light, but the only thing I saw the moment I opened my eyes was the kid now freed from the post with that man holding her gently in his arms. You didn't see anything? Nothing? No. I was far too scared to do anything. To give a CCRP. She sniffed, not meeting her eyes. The toll on the woman evident as the detective placed a hand on top of hers. Hoping to calm her. It wasn't your fault. He said softly. It was. She responded. Don't coddle me for trying to deny what I did. I wasn't a hero. I'm never one anymore. I'm just. Rumi. Useless. Rumi. She told herself. The detective now realizing that the woman had enough for one day. Her emotional sanity now once again lost. He looked at his colleague and they both nodded to each other. Miss Usajiyama, I believe we have everything we need. For the sake of your situation we should end the interview now, he said as Mirko merely nodded. Standing up as the other detective helped her up guiding her to the door as her secretary waited behind it. As soon as she left, the two detectives looked at each other. TSK, we didn't get much info on this Black Knight guy. The detective who did the interview said as he closed the folder. I don't blame her. Everyone's still in shock. Even she crumbled after being told to tell that experience again. Yeah, but this doesn't get us closer to the case. I'm still very suspicious about this vigilante. He replied as he took out a picture of the subject from the folder. You think he's part of this? He squinted his eyes at that statement. I'm not sure. The man has solved more crimes than most of Muzutafu's heroes can do in the PRD of just a few months. He has saved more people than even the top 10 in 1 month, excluding All-Might of course, but, if he is part of this, then does that mean that these events are staged? I feel that's unlikely given that all the cases we have of him are unrelated. SHT. But why did he show up so late this time if he did intend to save the day? The detective looked at the file and tapped his finger on it. There's also the fact that he managed to dispel that quirk or bomb that was tied to that kid without any effort whatsoever. That enough is suspicious. Then again, he could have been the best suited person to work with the scene due to his quirk and unpredictable nature. Yeah, he wasn't a pro-hero that's registered in the public's knowledge. Given that our suspect had enough research of our pro-heroes, then the level of surprise he could bring to the table could have helped him a lot. Still, he came late. That's the thing I'm very much worried and puzzled about. You think this guy's a villain? The two looked at each other. A silence permeated between them. Both unsure of that assessment as they looked at the picture of the Black Knight. Uncertainty filling their minds. The detective then turned the recorder off with a press of a button. Once again, the deathly silence returned. A taxi stopped by the gates of the prestigious school known as UA. The passenger paid the driver with a generous amount as she took her purse and stood in front of the institution as the taxi drove away. The woman fixed her suit by stretching it at the base as she took a deep breath in the process. She was slightly nervous. This was to be her new job after all. That is if the interview went well. Hopefully it did. A lot mattered in her getting approved of this new position. As she fixed her hair for any problems with it, the automated gates of the facility opened, with a person wearing a formal suit also greeted her in kind. This person, a woman as well with shapely features, guided her towards the halls and rooms of the main building of the campus. She looked around in slight awe and impression at the place. It was surely different and unique. She held on to her purse hoping to dispel her anxiety as the woman guided her to the principal's office where a chair was placed on her behalf, and the principal in question looking over her behind his desk. With a bow the woman was greeted with a cheerful welcome. The one who guided her took a seat on one of the couches within the room as she in turn sat on the designated spot of her interview. As soon as she got seated, the principal, an odd but not entirely strange fellow with his minuscule height and white fur, smiled at her in kind. He then placed a folder of her file on the desk and opened it. "Good morning. Lovely day, isn't it?" he said to her. With a nod she smiled as she adjusted her glasses. Her pale skin was not exactly common, but it was accepted. The world of quirks after all had removed some form of strangeness in people's eyes. "It is, sir. Though I am happy to be with you today. Quite excited to be honest," she replied. "Yes, it is very exciting. Having a new member of the faculty is appreciated. Especially with your very much impressive record. Miss Yuri," the principal said to her as he looked at her file. "You are far too kind, Principal Nizu." Yuri smiled at that compliment as a new task for her awaits. And she was ready to fulfill it. And now we're back live in JNN headquarters in continuation with our lovely host Aoi Citri herself and a groundbreaking interview with a special, renowned guest hailing from international waters and very much well known across the entire world for her philanthropic work. Please welcome her again. Miss Dekeozini of FATX International. A round of applause from the studio audience was echoed as the two occupants being filmed by the cameras smiled and waved towards them. The mood was all the more enthusiastic as cheers and positivity bloomed into the air as the rare and very much once-in-a-lifetime interview was happening right before their eyes. The subject in question that was being interviewed was a rather secluded figure that was less seen in public unless it was a charity event or an organized meeting with various people of power both politically and business situated in nature. Her methods were very much more well known across those who have seen or heard from her firsthand. Despite her rather secluded nature, she was very popular to the general populace, which contradicts her current situation with the media, where little to scarce footage of her being out in public was found. It became a popular trend to the social media base where her followers and those who admired her were more so adept at getting pictures or interactions from her rather than those in the official business of celebrity news or gossip. The knowledge on her background however was public and a multitude of books, interviews, off-cam, and personally written works were what decorated her already robust reputation. The reason to the tight-lid wall of media presence was due to the fact that the woman had a strong security presence. It was almost comical to some analysts and commentators that the security surrounding her was almost identical to those of the higher echelons of state leadership. To the woman herself however, the accumulated reputation behind her name was a hindrance to her pleasant and laid-back nature. A stark contrast to some of the other similar people in her line of work in this current day and age. Her presence alone exuded an air of calmness with the focus placed solely on her as the interviewer Aoi Citri recomposed herself from the quick commercial break in order to continue. "Thank you Ms. Hyuru for that wonderful opening once again," the woman said as the camera was now placed with her in the frame and her guest beside her. The production of the show was relegated in a late-night talk show format with the hostess sitting behind a modest desk while the guest was sitting on a comfortable chair beside it. Normally the composition was not supposed to be like this, but with the current guest that they were having, the producers of the show were more or less inclined to give way for it to happen. "Well, how are we doing so far MDM? I hope the sudden change of trying to learn Japanese for your viewers here wasn't so much of a hindrance or difficulty for a woman of your stature." the Citri woman said in a bemused tone as her guest smiled, modestly wearing a black blouse along with white pants that accentuated her simple features. Nothing much that would indicate her wealth was seen on her own person, except for a gold pendant that was hanging on her chest as a necklace. Her blonde hair was flowing by her shoulders as she relaxed on her seat. "Oh, please don't think of it that way, Ms. Citri. In my line of work, I have to be very transparent and respectful to local customs and traditions given its expansive nature. That's why endeavors like this tend to be a small sacrifice in my book. I do like to be closer to the ones that I'm trying to help, so in a way this experience of learning a new language already enhances how I view each citizen in each country or place I go to," the woman said in a pleasant tone as the Citri woman managed a small smile after that response. "Wow, that's already dedication on its own, especially since you sound so well in our tongue. Even the intonations and the way how you say each word make me think like you're already a native to our country. Are you really Greek by BLD? Or are you supposedly half Japanese at some point? Because me hearing you talk at this very moment is making me question this whole air of mystery surrounding you," the Citri woman said as she waved her hands in the air in an arc towards her guest in order to emphasize her point. Her guest giggled as the question lingered in the air. Even the audience in studio and those in their homes were also thinking the same thing. "I don't know about that, but I do try. It took me about 2 months to learn Japanese under an instructor. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but I do hope that I'm not making it all sound wrong to your ears. That's the last thing that I wish to happen." A small chuckle was shared amongst the studio audience as she said that. "Well, I'm not totally an expert as well when it comes to the deeper understanding of how our language flows in more considerably older parts of our current population, but to me you sound perfect. I bet if you weren't as popular as you are now, you'd fit just right in even with your different features. Some may even find it attractive to begin with, especially with an appealing face such as yours." The woman only gave a small smile in response as Citri continued. "Also, that instructor may very well be that good if he managed to shape you this way. I hope it wasn't a terrible experience. Was it a she, or a he? Do you mind on sharing?" Citri said in a speed that she was known for, rapid-fire questions from left to right, a facet of her personality that made most of the people she interviewed a bit overwhelmed by. A desired notion that made her unique against her competitors in the field, making her a sort of symbol of the nation's current state of investigative journalism. However, the woman in question was barely overwhelmed, and this was already her 5th try at making this tactic work, and for some reason this woman she was interviewing now was not falling for it. She was keeping those walls strong and straight. Their verbal battle, while on the surface was positive, was in reality more in line to a defensive standoff. Another thing that Citri was known by, given her reputation as an almost imposing figure in the world of real-time news coverage. To her guest's side in the standoff, she held on to that guard in an ironclad fashion, not even letting a lick of Citri's proverbial sword strikes through without blocking them completely. "It's a he, actually. I very much like those small few weeks we joined together to make me learn this new language I'm speaking at the current moment. He was a kind man. Married of course, and we would often talk about his family every now and then when we took breaks. I would say he was quite the ideal teacher. Oh, well, I think everyone thanks that man now, whoever he is, for being a representative of the Japanese spirit towards you. It actually makes my job and my cruise a lot more easier, to be honest. Some of our known international guests tend to use subtitles and interpreters to get our messages across. But mostly English, I myself becoming pretty well versed in it." The woman then smiled towards Citri as she rested her elbow on the sidearm of the chair she was sitting comfortably on. Her hand resting on her chin with those eyes. Intense, eyes that were hidden behind a pair of glasses she wore that had a slight purple tint. Her visage was friendly now and very much appreciative to the world around her, but through Citri's research, she found out that the woman had never once shown herself to anyone without those glasses on her eyes. She chalked it up as something that was trivial in nature due to many having the same situations regarding their eyes, but through her weeks on end preparations for this interview, she found it odd that the woman had a mannerism that kept her adjusting and fixing the position of her glasses every 10 seconds or so, even though they were firmly placed on her eyes with little to no chances of falling off. Her mannerisms made it oddly apparent that she was hiding something behind that face she was holding on to, like a secret that would supposedly ruin her image or some other reason that should befall once her eyes were revealed. It was a common thing that she noticed in her 5-year-long experience with the job she was holding. Some guests in her studio were more so afraid with how easy she could read them like a book, which allowed them to show some amount of nervousness despite their calm exteriors. In addition, even some international guests were intimidated by her style and choice of words. Her provocative aura sometimes made people uncomfortable, resulting in many well-earned criticisms thrown at her feet for her ability to rattle people both directly or indirectly in kind due to her tendency of being keen-eyed and opportunistic in nature. This said mannerism in general that the woman possessed, was what caught her attention, as it was a common sight for her in every known photo or video with her face appearing in them. One fan in particular even asked if she could allow a selfie 2 years ago with her glasses taken off, but the woman declined, almost defensively for a second before the two shrugged it off as nothing of note. This small detail made Citri curious. Alright, why don't we return to what we were talking about before the commercial break started? Specifically, with the line of work you tackle in the world stage. Your company, FATX International itself, is a large conglomerate organization dedicated to the welfare of common folk, as it states. With platforms going from medical research, archaeological institutes on preserving pre-Quirk-era artifacts and collections, socio-economic research institutes and commerce subdivisions, and lastly, acting as a vanguard towards human rights and law firms of which you dedicate to those without income to legally allocate themselves of their rights under each country's individual laws. Citri twirled her fingers reflexively on her desk as she continued. That last one I do find interesting, as you know that local leadership in communities does allocate government-hired lawyers to protect those without any income to represent themselves in court, but you seem to make them irrelevant in countries like South Africa and Ukraine, despite knowing that those same government-hired lawyers would lose their jobs due to your company's intervention. Yet at the same time those said lawyers nor local leadership don't seem to have any ill opinions about you and your men overseas. Tell me, why is that? The woman scrounged her face at that question but maintained her calm exterior. You see, it was never our intention to actually deface those employed by local law enforcement to represent those with little to no income in courts. The point of this service, that is without a doubt free of charge, is to allow higher quality protection for those without income to have a fair chance at having their cases resolved in a strictly corrupt-less environment or conjecture to thrive on. We are not saying that those in service that are employed by local law enforcement are corrupt or inferior to our hired lawyers, because we in turn work with them to make sure that the cases of those they tackle become fair in nature. In fact, the service is only voluntary, to which each citizen may only be allowed to use our service if the local lawyer and themselves agree on asking for our help. Due to that, I can humbly say that since our service is trustworthy, the local government and law enforcement actually work directly with our representatives to resolve cases that need our notice or assistance in any way or form. Citri, after hearing that, could not help but feel impressed. It answered her question in a straightforward manner, and to some other interviewers that were lesser than her in terms of caliber, they would stop right at that, immediately moving the discussion into another question entirely. However, straightforward as it was, it still left gaps. Gaps and questions that would fuel the ever-enlarging mystery surrounding this popular figure. A mystery that she had been intrigued and curious of for the past few weeks in preparation for this one interview. She would even come off to say publicly in all willingness to confirm that her last few interviews were more or less impromptu in terms of quality. Her reputation and fame along with her professionalism were the only things that kept her afloat and made sure that the shimmer behind her unpreparedness was hidden thoroughly behind a mask. She was just far too engrossed and obsessed with the case of her guest right now that all other thoughts or mindsets dedicated to her own craft was thrown out of the window. There was just far too many mysteries and questions that she wished to ask. Too much that at one point she already questioned her own sanity. The puzzle before her was unlikely to be pieced together as easy as that. And that was where the oddities started. Citri was never once this obsessed. Yet the woman before her bore such an aura of intrigue and mystery that something was almost grabbing her attention to provocatively make this whole interview different than her usual style of settling things. It was as if the woman already had her in this duel of words, a thought that made Citri shudder. And a thought that made her to push the envelope a bit further. I see. Well, that also falls into my other question, Ms. Dekeozini, your system. Your company, they are far too perfect in terms of success. Within all my research circling around you and your company's methods, I noticed that it seemed like the margin of error does not exist for you. There are no complaints, no questions, nor any ill will associated with anyone, and I mean anyone that has come across or interacted with you. All of them, even down to radicals reformed by your company under your medical branch, has more than enough good opinions surrounding you and your entourage. It's so DMN perfect that you can say that it's suspiciously, far too perfect. The woman tilted her head. What is that you're trying to ask, Ms. Citri? Citri placed the papers that she was holding in hand towards her desk. You have no faults, as it would seem. Forgive me for what I'm trying to say, and this is with the utmost respect, but to put it bluntly, you are an error in my eyes. An error that continues to exist because you are far too perfect. Far too successful in barely 14 years since you arrived to the scene. Citri said as a proverbial pin drop had now created an excess of silence. With murmurs and questions from the audience and those at home following suit. Citri then took one of the papers she placed on the desk and lent it towards her. The woman having a quizzical expression as she once again fixed the position of her glasses, when it was not needed to. What is this? The woman asked. That's a record that I managed to scrounge up after taking a few favors from my Greek colleagues. Forgive me for snooping, but I have a reputation of being thorough. One of them being that I study my subjects immensely before every interview, and your case, without a doubt, has made me greatly perplexed and obsessed that sleeping has become strong. She professed to everyone, having a light tone that was meant to be a joke, but it came off as something that came off as uncomfortable. Though her guest, as it would seem, was unfazed. Merely looking at the paper in her hand. And why exactly do you think of it that way, Ms. Citri? The woman asked, still having no traces of discomfort or concern on her face. What you're holding on to your hand is the certificate of your company's founding, yes? That is correct. Citri then tapped her table. Your company started out as a medical institute, with ties to psychiatric doctors hired domestically, which then grew into a research institute that doubled as a mental ward where your care for mentally ill patients that are rehabilitated, producing astounding, and sometimes miraculous results. Some even are allowed to return to the society completely sane and clean without any hitch. It also doubled as a hospital as well, a hospital, mind you, that has a successful rate of efficacy with each patient resulting in their full recovery. Even cancer patients, cancer, the bane of every medical doctor's existence, have all but been corrected by your hospital through your almost miraculous chemotherapy sessions. So, chemotherapy, while progressed in our time and age, has still killed at least 49.78% patients across the world due to the risks still factored by that method's effect towards the human body, and that percentage is only based as a flat value compared to the actual number of each known cancer in existence. The medical side of Quirk research has indeed made chemotherapy as a process a bit more friendly, but that is still 49.78%, Ms. Dekeozini. It is not 100%. And we're talking about cancer, for crying out loud. Cancer isn't the only disease or injury that your company has fixed into a 100% efficacy ratio. Don't you see how ridiculous that is? There was no incident nor patient that I could find during your humble beginnings that has had any bad or detrimental effect after your supposed handling of them. The woman looked at Citri with a more focused expression. One that Citri herself could not tell. Flustered perhaps. Still, she pushed on regardless of it. Pulling out another batch of papers, she placed them on the desk for her to see each one of it. Faces and names of people that were admitted into one of her hospitals across the world with their varying results that she and a few of her staff had noted and found. It just baffles me totally. All of these guys are one of the very few that I pulled off of your track records that stood out to me. I have no doubt that the number is larger than this in the cases of medical miracles, so to speak, but this also proves my point in question, right? Citri then pushed the paper containing a picture of a man with already healed scars across his face. The woman took the paper and looked at it. This man, retired pro hero working in Colombia, had a job that involved taking down illegal firearms stored by one of the known crime groups in his area. A bullet had hit his head square in the side of his head after those known criminals fired a pre-Quirk era .50 caliber rifle towards his direction. His quirk, a form of mutation that allowed him to mold materials into his body, was able to dampen the bullet's impact, albeit barely. The bullet itself was indeed considered an armor-piercing round during the days it was in use, so you would indeed understand that it did a hell of a lot of damage. Local doctors pegged him a lost cause, should they have worked on him in a form of surgery. A mortality rate of 78.34% existed. Pretty high, and even if some better, more experienced doctors were to work on him, he would have been pegged the same. Yet, a few hours later, after the family caught wind of your company's presence in the vicinity, they filed a motion of request to allow their son to undergo surgery. Despite it being in his head. I am so shockingly surprised still that this man still lives. While no longer a pro hero, he lives still with a normal life at home. Miraculous, isn't it? No words came from the woman as Citri pushed on. She pushed the next paper with a picture of a Japanese woman. This one had a history of violent tendencies. Probably one of the more recent ones in your track records that your medical institutes have put their hands on. A former villain captured due to her intensive, psychological ailment that had her lashing out violently and had almost zero social capabilities that some other specialists tapered her to a status that was close to resembling a dog with rabies. An assessment was done to see if this was due to her quirk, but her quirk was surprisingly not part of it. She was just as those specialists said she was, a rabid which in reality should only be placed in asylum, as sad as it sounds. Yet, your specialists came in a diplomatic mission and interacted with her. Within weeks, and I mean weeks, this woman had turned as calm as a rock in her cell. Due to the intervention of one of your specialists. Which is surprising, since no drag was administered, not even one single syringe or tablet was put in her system, nor even a mental-based quirk to begin with. She just became docile. Citri emphasized as a smile graced her features. Almost laughing. I know they relegated her to still not qualified for the outdoors, or social interaction with any civilian or outside personnel, but still. A rabid turned into a docile kitten within just weeks, when doctors of that same asylum needed years just to assess what the hell was wrong with her. You can't even blame those same doctors for being incompetent. They were more than qualified for their job, some even qualified to be standing shoulder to shoulder with your company's personnel. Yet what did your men do that they couldn't? Citri then pushed the rest of the other papers. She stamped her finger with minimal force on one. This person lost all of his ability to move his body due to nerve damage across his thoracic vertebrae after an accident. Only prosthetics and cutting-edge robotics were the only proxies that would allow him to have some semblance of normalcy left due to the very real and high possibility of death should he have gone extensive restructuring surgery on his spine. Of course, this one had no money to speak of, until your company intervened, and again miraculous. He can walk, albeit slowly, with a cane nowadays. Miraculous. She then moved her finger towards the next. This man had an immense disability due to his quirk affecting his entire body and persona. DID was the diagnosis given by 16 specialists due to the numerable 12 living personalities inhabiting one body. This was not just a figurative man with a fractured mind. He was a literal person housing almost 12 people inside his head due to the effects of his quirk. He was unstable in being part of society due to his tendencies to sometimes change into one of the more assertive or angrier personalities, yet as soon as your company once again graced their magic hands into this case, he has stabilized. Now working, as a simple office Joe in your company's employ. Funnily enough, he calls his recovery as something along the lines of God reciprocating his undying faith. With him thanking you immensely. Once again. Miraculous. She circled her hand on the last. The audience listening in quietly in the background. Even the producer of the show was given the go-ahead to extend the runtime of their current episode. Due to the ratings that not only came from Japan itself, but from other sources internationally. This was the very first time that an interviewer had asked these kind of questions to this guest they were having, and any at all interaction coming out of her was sure to be news. Still, the producers felt a bit unnerved with the risk Citri was playing with, painting their guest in a spotlight that allowed questions to her reputation to be asked. Some of the crew were even nervous about this, but they put their faith in Citri. Boy. Quirkless. 10 years old. Diagnosed with an unknown genetically induced disease that caused him to weaken to the point of death when in exposure towards people with quirks. At first, doctors thought the disease was caused by a quirk due to a proximity that the boy seemingly had. But all efforts to know about it more were halted due to the boy in an extreme case of bodily fatigue that would have killed if given enough exposure. Once again, a lost cause until your company intervened. The boy is now safe. A measure to stabilize his body amidst in the area of quirk population was made which was thought impossible at first, yet your company miraculously did it. They pinpointed a certain, electromagnetic frequency that this odd boy seemed to be weakened of that was coming out of each and every person that had a quirk. Simply astonishing, when you think about it. The woman then looked at Citri with a confused expression laced with uncertainty. May I ask why you're questioning the success of these people from their ailments or problems? Do you not wish that these people were to be healed or be exempt of such things? Citri then shook her head. No, of course not. Why would I? What kind of cruel monster would I be to suggest that I don't want these people to be exempt from their problems? Her voice was genuine there, but she pressed on. But before we circumnavigate this talk into something else entirely, I do wish to still wait for your comment or answer to these findings. Luck, perhaps, the woman said as if a joke, as the audience for some reason laughed. So I would infer to believe you that this is all based in luck. Oh come on. Let's be real here. I'm not as lucky as people think I am, and neither is the symbol of peace. Our glorious shining example of perfection is still human despite his contributions to society. But then again, nobody in the world remotely, nor nearly has the same luck as you. It feels as if you exist as a black hole of sorts that drags in all the good luck to sully your good cause. Which in turn moves me to my next few queries. Murmurs began to spread. Those sentences, those words that came from Citri's lips were very much prickly and passive-aggressive in tonality. It made the mood all the more intense. Citri, who was not aware of this yet, then gathered the papers on her desk and took out a remote from under it. With a click of a button, the screen on her stage between the two of them glowed to life. What is that? What else, Miss Takeozini? This is your summary of living expenses before you founded your company. I'd say the numbers are lowish, but I just find it strong to believe that a person such as yourself managed to build an empire in merely 10 years with this figure, and you started out as a person that funded medical institutions despite not being a doctor, nor anything really. All you have is your name, and this money. Money that you progressively gave, which then in turn built an entire international cooperation out of, without hiccups no less. This isn't even just you, to be terribly honest. With a click of a button the screen changed. Your company works on charities, research in areas of commerce, medicine, anthropology, archaeology, mental institutes, law firms, and even some form of rehabilitation programs aimed at numerous staples all across the world. The best known are those in Africa and here in Japan, You wish to help in efforts to consolidate and stabilize the localized problem that pro-heroes of this nation are now handling with. The crime rate that is slowly but steadily increasing yet again, along with some of the public's views on the current quirk law as a means to help those who are having problems financially with their social statuses. Citri enumerated as she then clicked another button. Recently I found out that your efforts are also there to reintroduce religions to some communities. The Vatican Restoration Project being the best example. The current era of the population of the world right now seems to throw away the notion of a divine providence existing somewhere due to the emergence of quirks. Further solidifying evolution in its bizarre state in more progressive researches. This means that the world has outgrown the social norm that is religion, with many lost after the wars and chaos dealt by the emergence of the quirks into society. Japan has fortunately kept most of our pre-quirk era culture unlike the rest of the world, but you having an effort to salvage these religions made me curious. Curious? I merely did the right thing, Ms. Citri. What is so curious about that? This. Citri stated as she pointed at the screen. Esharam Abasai, a former retired Pakistani peacekeeper, trying to reinstate a pre-quirk era religion into his community down in Karaman, Turkey. We all know the statuses of the now former Middle Eastern states after the ruckus caused by the emergence of quirks 200 years ago. Pakistan, much to their luck, has thrived despite the social collapse of some of its neighboring powers during that time, but a lot has changed after their turn from being a third world country in the last few decades compared now. Obviously no country is the same as the next, that's why their system of pro-heroes per se has been relegated into a peacekeeper program. Similarities are a bit slim against some of the more known systems in the world, but in the end the thought process is similar. Citri bit her lip. Esharam and his family migrated from Pakistan after a very known scandal that was related to him. Fortunately, he was called on to as innocent, but his reputation plummeted immensely despite that. So in order to escape from the shame his fellow countrymen threw towards him, he made the best choice to move into Turkey, wherein lies a neutral ground. Esharam in essence is an old-school fanatic of his chosen faith. Despite wanting to lay low at first because of his current predicament, he resulted in trying to reteach this faith back into the locals, which was generally a polarizing idea due to Turkey's population now being influenced by the current mindset surrounding quirks and society. The idea of an almighty, as I said, has been overshadowed by the emergence of quirks that Esharam found it blasphemous in nature, causing him and his followers to take small acts towards the streets in a peaceful manner. Some of the population condemning them for ruining the peace, so to say, but they weren't very violent to begin with. They were just upset that the world had now foregone such ideals that they possessed. Until, of course, you and your people. Citri said as the woman looked at her. I do remember a kind man by that family name. I grew to respect him greatly due to his drive to revive his faith in that region. I supported it even. The woman said with a kind smile. Yes, and that's where it goes weird. Esharam was very much a fanatic. He was upset by the current age and their views towards his faith, but at the same time he was also vastly upset about other faiths and religions that he and his descendants have encountered many decades before him. According to his family, he even foul-mouthed a believer of another pre-quirk era faith in the past. But now, not only has he become a more devout leader of his new flourishing sect, he has now grown very positive in your attempts to re-establish cultural elements of the pre-quirk era back into modern day, religions included. Citri once again pushed a button showing an image of Esharam. His robes now black, with violet and gold accents. The symbol of his faith now replaced by something else. He was smiling to the camera as he placed his arm around Citri's current guest, with another known religious leader at their side. This sect that he's established has turned from being a polarizing ideal placed into a country with a progressive mindset, into now a flourishing faith prospered by many new attendants joining them in service. All of this was after you and your anthropological branch came in contact with him. I would say that our intervention and idea was to make these old elements and parts of our culture relevant again into the modern world. I believe him reviving that element of faith into his community was a bonus. A bonus that I am very much proud of. The woman replied. I know. I don't want to argue against you about that. That is totally justifiable, and I am part of the audience when I say that I agree with how good that notion of thought is. Citri said. Are you? Really? The woman asked. A pause was felt after the woman asked that. It made Citri's well-known rapid-fire style to completely halt in an instant. Even the audience felt it. Citri now wished to reinstate her claim in this discussion. Truthfully, she acknowledged that up to this point her words and technique came off as harsh, aggressive, rude even, but it was because she wanted to know the answers to the questions boggling her mind with her guest now. Some of her questions were not even approved by her producers, and to her it was sort of miraculous that they had not told her to back down yet. She was known to be unbiased due to her style of interviewing, a very much different style that was completely unlike any other show in her field in Japan. However, as she acted now with how words played out, she seemed to be the bad guy in this situation, when in her mind she was not. So in that very mindset, she allowed herself a heavy sigh. Wanting herself to calm down. She did not want this to turn into anything that resulted into a negative output, both for herself and for those that were watching. Her reputation was not the only thing that she cared about, it was also the integrity of the news networks in Japan that she was now representing towards her guest. In a same manner of vein, she considered this whole ordeal as polarizing if she could comment on it, and she knew that the audience thought of it as the same. Yes. I do. Please know that what I'm trying to convey here is not to deface your image in any way. You see, I research my guests deeply. Yours was just the first time that I managed to snag so many questions in my mind, as the pieces for the most part, in my head never coalesce or join together soundly. Also, I did want this to be a more civil discussion for the most part. I am honest in my thoughts that I came to be antagonistic towards you, and I am sorry for that. However, please do indulge me at least in telling me why all of these things you've done in your career have amounted to such mysteries that I still struggle to understand. Silence once again permeated in the room. The woman to this point was still in her same expression as before. Citri was used to her guests being more open or at least flustered with her questions, but this woman was tough. Even the gaps that she wanted to exploit were still not opened. Do not worry, Miss Citri. I respect your line of work. I have endured so many interviews off-cam that have amounted to this same compassion towards my background. You have nothing to be sorry for in terms of how you handle things. I completely understand why you would think so, and I am actually enjoying how our little talk is coming on about my life story. You are a very interesting person, and I value people like you who say what you want to say, instead of those that simply put on a face and say nothing of what their true intentions lay. The reply surprised Citri, along with the audience. The woman who was smiling earlier was now having a more understanding expression. She was no longer constantly fixing the position of her eyewear around. Yet that last statement felt like a subtle jab that not even a simpleton would be amiss by. Anyway, you may continue on your point, and I'll gladly answer what I can from your questions. Citri felt her forehead now glistening in sweat. Why was it? Why was talking with her giving off such an odd atmosphere? Why did it hover in a pleasant and ominous vein at the same time? Why, yes, thank you. She immediately said, not wanting for the woman to wait on her response. Anyway, these are the rest of the other subjects of interest that I have gotten from your track record. Namely, all of them are religions of numerous sects and kinds all around the world, from the very brink of their extinction has now turned into functioning, sometimes thriving organizations of faith after your interventions. This in turn made your status as palpable worldwide, not just in a business standpoint, nor even in a political standpoint. You have become a beacon of hope for a innumerable amount of reasons that I am sure even the audience has lost count. All of it, in the excess of 10 years after you first appeared into the scene. The woman smiled, not to her achievement but towards the memories of the people she helped. At the same time I wonder why these organizations of faith you re-established into the world were the same symbol and attire. Almost as if their distinction from each other is no longer a problem. Citri asked as images of said faiths on the screen all conjured the same symbol. The same symbol that was on the woman's gold pendant tied into a necklace on her chest. Citri looked at it before refocusing on the woman's eyes once more as she replied. I have already told them that honoring me is not needed. I will reinstate however that they still do the practices along with the symbols and doctrines their individual sects use. I tried telling them to refrain from using the symbol of my own faith to begin with, but they seem to ignore it. I would call it bothersome, but I am far too respectful to say it against them. Which is why I just let them be. The woman said in a light tone as some of the audience chuckled lowly. Oh, so you believe in a faith of your choosing as well? Yes. I do. I pray immensely for the goodwill of the world, Ms. Citri. I'm even proud to call myself as a devout follower of my faith. Interesting. Could this be the source of your luck, as it would seem? Or do you believe there are more reasons behind it? Citri asked. No. I don't think that is the case. Actually, I'm sort of overwhelmed with the sort of perfect veil of achievements you sprinkled towards me earlier in this conversation about the many miraculous things my organization has done towards the lives of many people we touched. The woman said with a chuckle, but Citri did not laugh. She was more so interested with what she was trying to say. Yet you have to understand that unlike what you said, nobody is perfect. Everyone has flaws. Flaws and flukes in life that allow them to be the people they are now. Learning from the mistakes and lows of life is what makes us human after all, and even with the track record of success your research has unearthed. I don't think you've actively seen the failures or the mistakes my organization has been unable to solve. You've only dialed down on the successes instead of seeing the other side of the picture. Painting me as an almost saint-like figure with many achievements to my name is all right in my book, but I would also like to acknowledge the many bootlicks of failure that came along the way to make me deserving of who I am today. Citri nodded. Perhaps I did look too deeply in that facet of your history. She said in a low tone. And that is totally fine, it's all right to do so. But do understand that not all our cases ended in a favorable clause. If I may, I want to point out a few names that you can go find information about. One of them pertains of a little girl, by the surname of Souza, who had undergone treatment in our hospitals. We once thought of her as a success. Until she died 2 days later after a shocking complication we were not able to determine. The audience began to talk to each other in hushed tones towards that fact. Another was an old man by the name of No, which had an intensive psychological impairment that had him to commit suicide after 3 days of treatment. I can go on with more examples, even a Japanese native a few years ago that came to us with a severe condition relegated to his stomach and lungs. I won't divulge the man's name as I personally visited him myself, but his body was damaged to the point that he no longer supports a stomach and one of his lungs are strained severely, limiting his ability to continue working in his career after extensive surgery done by our own doctors. It was heartbreaking to see it actually, the stitches in his stomach still an eyesore to my memory even now. He's doing well, but I fear he may need to retire soon because of that injury. The audience had no comment on that. Neither an understanding on who the woman was talking about. Despite that, it did home in what she tried to say. I am not perfect. No one is. We're only humans, and being human that means we should accept being able to experience mistakes, setbacks, and even failure. That is the core ideal that makes us what we are, what we try to be better of. To strive on doing the right thing for next time. No one is exempt of that. Even me, and dare I say I have suffered a lot in my younger years than I care to admit. The woman then touched her pendant. The symbol glistening in faintly towards the studio lights. I am here because I had faith in being better than myself and striving to correct the mistakes of my past to be who I am now. I don't care about achievements, I care about what matters, justice. The final word made everyone feel as if goosebumps crawled down their backs. Even Citri felt it, as if the woman's words carried with them a degree of something else. Something, drawing power from her own words that seemed to allow people to flock towards her. It was unsettling. Yet calm and serene at the same time. Thank you for that was amazing coming from you. Citri commended. You are welcome. Alright, so. I think my next question is due. Citri said, unsure how to progress the interview now. The woman then tilted her head. What question would that be? It pertains to your visit here in Japan. Ah yes, mostly it was to see some of the facilities we have here along with support for a friend that I have grown to like these days. I believe that someone would be Yua Satoru, correct? Yes, that would be her. She has asked my help on a certain key issues surrounding your country at the moment. One pertaining about the slow rise of incidents lately. My condolences still towards those that lost their lives last week from those attacks. Part of the reason I came was because of that. Are you not afraid what your presence may entail? Of course not. Your system of quirk law and heroes are well renowned throughout the world. All Might of course resides here. I have no means to fear when your system has proven to be effective in protecting your citizens. So, you don't know about the current situation then? I believe the current population of Japan are strong pressed in a polarized debate about the current times. Some even flock towards groups that now do not believe in the current system of quirk laws and regulations, nor has their faith in pro-heroes become positive. The woman shook her head towards Citri as the audience became uncomfortable with the topic. No. I am very much aware, which is why supporting Yua Satoru is tantamount to what I am trying to achieve here. Faith in heroes is needed, and her influence along with our partnership should hopefully heal the view of the public towards the current problem. I see, well, this is the main topic that has put much of Japan into heavy debate. Yua Satoru specifically had asked her fellows within the House of Representatives to try and mend this growing divide through a means of adding and updating some certain parts of the current law to solve the issue. I am blatantly aware that Ms. Satoru has a large following gathering around her both in public and in politics, but I am still a bit doubtful at how it will all help, unless the current PM administers to do something big. Then that means I have a lot to do then in terms of my visit here. The woman said as Citri's producer then asked her through her earpiece that she should ask her guest about that question. She visibly flinched at that suggestion but looked at the woman and decided to go through it. Seems like it. But before we finish off with our interview, Ms. Dikeozini, may I ask what your honest opinion is towards our current quirk law and system? Since you are affiliated with Ms. Satoru, that means we can at least get a few words on how you view the system as a whole, as some members of the public have now gone on to question it after what happened a week ago in those terrible attacks. Citri said in genuine curiosity as the woman smiled towards her in a kind notion. I think I have already told you what I thought of it earlier, the woman asked. Yes, but I would wish to hear a more in-depth point of view from yourself more clearly. It should provide the audience and those at home what you think of this whole matter entirely. Ah. Makes sense. The woman agreed. Well, Ms. Dikeozini, may we hear your opinion? The woman then did what Citri and the audience never expected. She took off her glasses and immediately her image changed from that of a kind-hearted soul into an immensely serious and intimidating sight to see. Gone was the quiet disposition on her face as her eyes, for some reason, had changed the air around her. They were intensely focused. Like a glare was stapled on her face permanently, with those eyes conveying a sense of world weariness that would put some others into a deep silent stare of fright. It felt as if the entire studio had unleashed something that was meant to be hidden behind those glasses as the woman's posture and mannerisms turned from honest humility into steadfast pride and steel-like conviction. Her smile looked unnerving, yet they carried with them a sense of bolstering faith towards those already captured by her words and deeds. Very well, and please call me Nia, Miss Citri. You have earned my respect to call me that, and so, I will repay it all back in a handsome way. Even her tone had changed slightly. A detail that made Citri gulp with what sort of thing she just unleashed. Time, 2:36 p.m. Eyewitness, Tateyuki Kazumi, aka Crust, the shield hero. The afternoon sun was shining in the sky as cars rode by. The cityscape slowly disappearing out the window as the vehicle moved ever so forward towards their desired destination. The entire ride was mostly quiet, as the serene atmosphere of their comrades being close by alleviated any fears from each man and woman that was tasked to their current job. That job being to covertly escort House Representative Yua Satoru quietly towards a meeting she would be needed in to hopefully solve the current crisis the country was struggling in. The job entailed 3 vehicles, inconspicuous in nature supposedly with at least 3 security teams in each vehicle on standby. Security in general had now grown tight after the Gehenna incident last week as it prevailed to assuage the mood of certain violent criminals all across Japan after that bold act of violence. Televised and experienced not just in one city but in 2. This made most villain groups entitled to do their fair share into the chaos as faith in pro-heroes were disturbed despite All Might's presence. However, the situation while problematic was not dire in any sense. The crime rate, while steadily increasing along with accounts of more and more vigilantes coming into play, was still in a more manageable number than when the Quirk law was first established. The public, while shaken by the events, are still predominantly in a more neutral opinion towards the current state of society, but at the same time those who already had large negative opinions about the system had used this as a means to assuage some people to take action. It boosted a lot of other things that made the current populace think, and while this was still an issue that could and would be solved, it was still a problem regardless. Despite that, due to the gloom of paranoia now hovering over the populace, measures of security had now doubled, and this included Yua Satoru herself, who has been a very outspoken figure towards support on the established system and pro-heroes in general. She was without a doubt the key of Japan's leadership right now to pull the public's opinion back towards normalcy due to her reputation and name towards the public, but at the same time this was the reason why security around her along with other key figures in government are now doubled. Her specifically with the vocal majority that she leaned on, allowing her to have many enemies in unknown number of levels within society. This in turn would make the current security officers working in tandem now to feel nervous. Although they were not very concerned right now due to the presence of one person amongst their midst who was asked to join the convoy to assure their VIP's safety in order to make this a smooth transition. Said man was enthusiastic after taking this job, and was happy to assuage the doubts and fears of the security team present. The presence of a highly capable pro, that was crossing the top 10 line no less made them breathe in assuredness that this would go safely as it could be. However, due to the subtler and quieter nature of this SCRT, this same man inwardly felt bored. He sighed as he looked outside of the window. The sun glowing on his face as he stared. "You know, it's not always this boring as you think it is, sir," the driver beside him said. He was riding in the leading car beside the driver. The vehicle was a dark blue SUV that allowed the number of 5 passengers excluding the driver to operate. Each security officer had their gear on themselves while wearing formal civilian attire underneath. Their issued weapons and equipment partly strapped inside their vests and within care inside stored compartments within the vehicle. "No, don't mind me. I'm just not used to more quieter missions and tasks. It's just the calmness of everything that seems to distract me. I'm used to more livelier things." The man known to the public as the Shield Hero Crust said as he looked at the driver. The other officers behind them minding their own business or talking to each other in a different set of discussion. The driver on the other hand, after hearing his words smiled. "Heh, I will promise you that it gets better when we get to our destination. More so in fact that you're here. I have no doubt that some of your fans or admirers would flock the moment it's made public that you're seen with Ms. Satoru. The gossip around her is already big enough as it is." He laughed at that statement as a smile reached his ire. He had not met the woman personally yet due him being discreetly placed in this car, but he had heard of her. He had seen pictures, videos, and all other media surrounding the woman. To his opinion, based on what he saw, is that she was the real deal. A real and rare case of an idealistic person in power doing the right thing. Plus, she was quite renowned for her beauty and striking features. Oh yeah. Do I need to ready myself of such gossip straight to the face once the vultures see me? He replied in a joking manner as most occupants within the vehicle chuckled. You have no idea, sir. If that incident with All Might a few months ago was any indication, then the media ruckus after your scene will also blow up quickly before we can do anything about it. I wouldn't be too sure about that. He admitted. Why do you say that, sir? Aren't you popular enough to be considered as a would-be top 10 hero in the next rankings? The driver asked. Nah. I'm not sure about that. I acknowledge that I have a fan base, but in no way am I in the leagues of All Might or Endeavor. Heck, even Hawks and Edge Shot are more popular than me. He modestly said as he thought about his career. The occupants of the vehicle, however, did not totally agree on his words. You sell yourself far too short, sir. I'm pretty sure you're pretty popular with the masses. He chuckled to that statement as he looked at the driver, the mood in the car eventually becoming livelier as he continued to talk. The others behind them now taking some interest to the conversation. What makes you think that? How's an old man like me anything compared to those youngsters? Old? Pardon us for asking, sir, how old are you? How old do you think? The driver glanced at him for a second before returning his eyes on the road. The others behind them also thinking the same thing, trying to guess the hero's age based on his appearance. Oh come on, I may have called myself old but I'm not that old. He said in an attempt to cheer them up as one of the officers thought of an answer. 46. Ha. I may look middle-aged but in no way am I near my 50s. 38, another officer asked. Close, but come on guys, do you really think I'm that old? The officer behind him giggled as Crust looked at him, gesturing towards the slew of white hair atop his head. Hey! This is part of my style. White hair doesn't always equate to old. A lot of heroes have white hair and they're completely young and able. An almost comical face that was supposed to be disappointed was plastered on the hero's face. One that made the entire vehicle laugh in response. To Crust's own mind, however, that was the goal. Certainly making the entire trip livelier was better than just staring out of the window, hoping that something interesting would happen. Any other guess? I'm sure you've already got the gist of it. One of you nearly had it after all. The driver smiled as he thought about himself. In conjunction, he still kept his focus on the road as less and less traffic breezed by them as the cityscape backdrop had now vanished. Trees of green now slowly encumbered both sides as mountains and other terrestrial plains filled the background. A number of structures, namely shops or homes, were scattered, but the more busier parts of the city they came from was now vanishing. This made the entire atmosphere that was silent at first, more cheerful as the stress accumulated from the more populous regions of the country was whisked away even for a moment's pause. 32, one of the car's occupants said in a guest-like tone. Crust smiled happily at that evocation as he put on his cheery smile. It was not as popular as the more well-known All Might smile, but his cheerful demeanor and energy is part of what made Crust's own version known to the people that frequently interacted with him. Well done. Took longer than expected, but I guess it was strong seeing that my face is still pretty youthful in appearance. He stated as a round of snickers and giggles came forth. And what's the name of our winner? I would very much like to hear it. Crust then saw an average man of average build behind the driver's seat. He had black hair and a more youthful appearance than the rest of his comrades. Thinking that the man was new, he was encouraged to start a conversation with him, as most of his fanbase was relegated to the age that this man was supposedly in. Oh, it's Murayama, sir. Well, it's nice knowing you, Murayama. Pray tell, are you perhaps new to this job? Before the man could say, the driver beside Crust spoke for him. Greenhorn there is just about 2 weeks old. He got drafted rather quickly coming from a police background. Funnily enough, he got accepted because he's secretly lovey-dovey with one of Ms. Satoru's staff. The driver jokingly said as Murayama turned rather annoyed at the statement. I did not. That was a fair and clean acceptance, sir, there was no behind-the-scenes work involved. Murayama expressed back as the car's occupants laughed. Sure is, kid, sure is, and since we're in the topic of names. How about me and my guys introduce ourselves, the driver offered Crust, who nodded in anticipation. Why not? We are working together after all. He replied as the men behind them agreed. The one behind the hero specifically taking the first turn. Kates, pleasure to meet you, sir. The man said with a hand extended. Same to you. He replied with a handshake that eventually the entire car introduced themselves one by one. The two in the very back specifically called themselves Kiba and Kagurashi. Interestingly, after introducing one another, a small round of banter was exchanged as the occupants and the hero allowed themselves to get to know each other while the ride progressed. Eventually, Crust began to familiarize each person not by their name but by their background. Specifically knowing that, alike what the others said earlier, that Murayama was a star cadet of the police academy, earning the top of his class and graduating in high honors. At first he wanted to continue his career in pursuing the occupation but was eventually taken by inspiration after meeting Yua Satoru up close. This turned out, according to him, as a life-changing event, as he made the risk of trying to be part of her own internal security group rather than continue on in service as a policeman. The occupants of the car began to laugh and tease him about it as a decision that cost him a better career, but he was very much through with the choice and was happy to be part of the group, not just for himself but for his praise for the woman they were protecting. In the same vein, it was almost that similar mindset that drove Kates to join the group as well. The man had short brown hair, barely an inch in length, making him very distinct than the others in the car. He was bigger and more built than his comrades, but he was not imposing nor that intimidating up close. He exuded an air of expertise around him. One that made Crust wonder as to why. Eventually the man revealed that he was once part of the tactical unit specialization of the police force in Hosu back then, with missions under his belt extending to a figure of 23. He was about to retire into a normal life before the driver, the man beside Crust, convinced him to join Yua Satoru's protection. He was then eventually enamored by the woman herself in her many endeavors and was now committed to serve for her as her bodyguard. Kagurashi, interestingly, was actually a female despite her androgynous qualities. Her hair was shoulder-length at best, and you would in fact mistake her for a male if you had not seen her eyes close. The reason being was that her quirk was somewhat towards her eyes and had a distinct effect to anyone seeing it for a few seconds. This in turn forced her to wear specialized contacts that minimized this effect while also allowing her hair to cover her eyes like a veil. Crust vaguely recalls a cliché about it in the internet that he heard about men having no eyes being a hentai. Please refrain from thinking of me as a pervert. I do have a husband, so to speak, but I'm not a hormonal teenager that lives in a basement. A few chuckles came as a nickname given by the entire group towards her made the woman furious. Crust was slightly nervous after the woman lashed out after the laugh, but the others seemed to be used of it. Aside from that detail, however, it was revealed that the woman was formerly a sidekick to known pro hero Yoroi Musha at about 2 years ago. The old hero nowadays never accepts any more sidekicks to his agency, making Kagurashi surprisingly the last known person to ever work closely with the man. Surprisingly, Kagurashi was a rare case of a dual quirk user, but during her stay at Yoroi Musha's agency, it seemed that the portion of her abilities that came from the eyes were lesser developed than her proficiency with her other, unnamed quirk. She was drafted to the group after she had met Yua Satoru up close, and she never regretted a single thing after that. Even her license and status as a functioning pro was a small price to pay in her mind. Crust felt a bit disappointed at that detail, as he prided himself with his career immensely. thinking rather strong as to why someone would forego the life of a pro-hero to be something else. But he respected it regardless. If Yua Satoru was as good as talks about her were, then he would not judge anyone who follows her closely as she does. The last man, a man of a few words by the name of Kiba, was a tall man with an average build that was probably at least a few centimeters higher than Crust's own height. He had reptile-like pupils along with blue, wavy hair to compensate it. He told the others that he was once a freelance security operator for hire in both legal and shady backgrounds. This made Crust a little bit uncomfortable and suspicious, but was asked to take part in a joint cooperation task with Yua Satoru's group and had never left ever since. His loyalty is assured to be in the woman's hands while also being put in a government reformation program for some vigilantes or wildcards that were operating currently. It was a faulty program that spilled some very mixed results, but in the end it benefited the position that Kiba was in right now. After hearing each and everyone's tale one by one, Crust would not help but notice that this particular Yua Satoru was very much someone that needed to be respected with and admired by. Given that her efforts had left a rather remarkable mark on each person he was now acquainted with currently. It made him think how he should judge the woman personally after they meet face to face once they arrive at their destination. The media spur around it was going to be a hassle, but then again that was one of the reasons why he was asked to be part of this SCRT. With the public's shaken view on pro-heroes as of late, his presence would create a bond of trust that the country's emerging political figure would secure towards the masses. Given that the woman was deemed as a shining torch that many people relayed their hopes on, it was pertinent to show that the woman's safety was assured with a pro-hero's help. This would help in the long run for everyone, and Crust was not dumb enough not to think of the implications his role in this would do for society. However, one thing did make him wonder after everyone explained their backgrounds. It was that the driver beside him had not told his side of the story yet. And apparently he held a higher position of rank within the car as everyone addressed him as Sir rather than their names. Eventually the man noticed this as Crust looked at him in anticipation. Oh, is it my turn now? So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 2. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author lazyfrogofjustice on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.